Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Fiber Broadband Association's Fiber for Breakfast. We're now in our 48th episode of 2024. Before we kick off, I'd like to thank Wesco, the platinum sponsor for Fiber for Breakfast. As we are moving into the holiday season, it's really a good time to reflect on how much we've accomplished this year. And it's an incredible time for industry, and 2025 promises to be very exciting, to say the least. I hope everyone's able to spend time with their families this week and enjoy a wonderful Thanksgiving holiday. And even though we're in the holiday season, we still have a lot on our plate to accomplish before the end of the year, especially as we plan for 2025. Up next for the Fiber Broadband Association is our premier members meeting in Florida on December 9th and 10th. And we're going to be discussing strategy and setting our direction for 2025. Also, as we enter 2025, we'll be working our way around North America with an amazing lineup of regional Fiber Connect events. And February will be in San Antonio, and then we'll move to Philadelphia in March. Fiber Day in the Hill will be in April again. Then we have our big granddaddy Fiber Connect 2025 Nashville, 5,000 our closest friends, June 1st to 4th. Then we'll be in Anchorage, Alaska, July, and Toronto, August. Scottsdale, Phoenix area on October, Kansas City in November, and then again our premier member meeting will be in Palm Springs, California next December, a year from now. And that brings us to today's Fiber for Breakfast session. Our guest is our good friend, Kathryn de Wit of Pure Charitable Trust, who's going to share with us Pure's latest efforts on making sense of dollars spent on digital equity. But before I formally introduce today's guest, I'd like to introduce David Norris from our team, who's going to walk us through some housekeeping items.
Thank you very much, Gary, and thank you everybody who's joined us today. We appreciate it. Before I go over a few logistics, we'd like to once again thank our platinum sponsor, Fiber for Breakfast, Wesco. Now, please keep in mind, as attendees, you are in listen-only mode today. To ask a question, please type it into the question box, which is located within the control panel on the upper right of your screen. We will also host a Q&A session with our panelists at the end of today's session. This presentation is being recorded and will be available on the FBA's website within 24 to 48 hours, and you can find that recording in the Events tab under the Fiber for Breakfast drop-down option. Finally, at the conclusion of today's presentation, you will be prompted to complete a brief feedback survey. Please take a moment to do so. We appreciate your input. And with that, I will hand things back over to Gary to introduce our panelists and get us started. Gary?
Thanks, David. Good morning. I'm Gary Bolton, the President and CEO of the Fiber Broadband Association. Last week on Fiber for Breakfast, our guests were Paroma Sanyal and Coleman Brazilian from the Battle Group, who shared their latest National Economic Impact Study, the economic impact of fiber deployment. This study was the first of its kind, as it illustrated 3.2 trillion, that's trillion with a T, of economic impact from fiber versus other high-speed broadband solutions, such as cable HFC. And so of that 3.2 trillion, about half, 1.6 trillion, the benefit came from the increase in home values, and the other half, that 1.6 trillion, came from the increase in income from having fiber. So if you missed that last week's session, you can go to our website and watch the replay. Today on Fiber for Breakfast, our guests are good friend Kathryn de Wit from Pew Charitable Trust, who will share with us Pew's latest efforts on making sense of dollars spent on digital equity. Kathryn de Wit directs Pew's Broadband Access Initiative, which works to accelerate efforts to connect millions of Americans to affordable, reliable, high-speed internet. In addition to working with policymakers, researchers, and other stakeholders to improve policy outcomes, de Wit also includes addressing research gaps and bringing together stakeholders for data-driven decisions on how to ensure every American benefits from universal connectivity. Prior to Pew, de Wit was an associate with Booz Allen Hamilton, where she focused on broadband deployment, organizational management, and public affairs. And she's also a senior fellow at Heinz Endowments, leading projects on youth philanthropy and community engagement. Kathryn holds a bachelor's degree from Penn State and a master's in public administration from the University of Pittsburgh. So welcome, Kathryn. And for audience, type in your questions as we go, and we'll work them into discussion. With that, I will turn things over to Kathryn.
Thanks, Gary. It is always so great to be with you and your entire team in the Fiber Broadband Association. I'm really sorry for that mouthful of a bio. I promise next time it'll be shorter. but appreciate the very clear loyalty to Pittsburgh and all things Pennsylvania. So yeah, well, yes, exactly. Thank you. Hey folks, it's great again to be back. Gary just gave you an overview of who I am. But for those of you who aren't familiar with Pew, or maybe you're like my parents and have only heard of us listening to the news and hearing about polling data, let me just give you a quick background. Pew is a nonprofit, nonpartisan research organization. Our job is to work with lawmakers and policymakers at every level of government in the United States, and actually all over the world, on a range of issues, from protecting and working to preserve water and marshlands, to broadband, and to state fiscal health. Please don't ask me about the water and marshlands. That's not my area of expertise, but I have colleagues who have it if y'all have questions. I've been leading the Broadband Access Initiative now for about 6 years, and our work really does focus on the role of states in advancing and achieving universal access to broadband. And over the last few years, I think, as everybody knows, in case you haven't, federal policy and states have really started to merge together. So through that work, we are not only looking at how individual states are responding and creating their own policy structures to improve not only access to the internet, but the economic and quality of life benefits that come with it. We're looking at how they're integrating and applying federal funds. So you call us when you want to make some sense of what states are doing, A, and then B, when you want the national perspective and that 50-state perspective. Before I jump in to the presentation, I just want to say a few words around the state approach to broadband and kind of what's happening with digital equity. And as I'm saying that word, I'm just going to get this out of the way now. I know that equity can be a charged word. Like, let's not dance around that. It can be a charged word. That's okay. But what I hope all of you will walk away with today is understanding how Congress and now states really envision BEAD and DEA working together. And they design these programs to work together because of what all of you know as members of FBA, that yes, high-speed, reliable internet can open up opportunities for communities, for businesses, but that's not a guarantee. And you need to have adoption, skilling, access to devices. You need all of those things in order for those benefits to potentially become a reality. But what you really need is, for lack of a better term, a systems-wide approach on working with different sectors and segments of the public sector and industry in order to ensure that communities really are fully benefiting and able to participate in today's world. So I think the other thing too, quite frankly, is when we talk about the economic utility of fiber, of high-speed, reliable, affordable broadband, we also want to know that the investment that Congress, that the taxpayers have made in these networks is working. And again, going back to research from the Battle Group and others, it's not just the presence of technology that really drives those economic outcomes. It's what you can do with it. So with that, let's jump in. Okay, so my team analyzed plans, the digital equity plans from all 52 states and territories that submitted them. And before I talk to you about what we found, I am going to use the researchers' prerogative here and talk to you about why plans matter. Whether you are designing a business or a policy program, or I don't know, planning a wedding, plans define the what. Sorry, Gary, I know you're still fresh off of your own daughter's wedding, so sorry if that's triggering for you. But plans define the what, the how, the why, and how we'll measure success. They're also, particularly in the public sector, really effective tools for completing what one might call the thankless task of herding cats across different agencies who are not accustomed to working with one another. So when you go through this planning process, you're not only saying, identifying the problem and here are potential solutions for improving it. When you have a mandate to say, yes, I need the Department of Education at the table. Yes, I need the Department of Health and Human Services at the table. that really allows a public agency to develop a holistic strategy that kind of breaks down the silos that exist between agencies, but also that what we found were impeding folks' ability to benefit from connectivity. So with that, when IIJA was passed, there were several planning requirements within it. So there's a 5-year action plan for BEAD, and then there is a planning requirement for the Digital Equity Act. And again, in short, these plans are defining the problem, defining potential solutions for the states, and then how they'll work with other entities to solve those problems. That's like the 100,000 foot view. So what was interesting was that these plans also gave states the opportunity to apply what they had been learning earlier in COVID around where there were gaps in information and connectivity and collaboration across government. So these plans were meant to, one, ensure that lawmakers and Congress and states knew what was going on, how were states planning to spend the money, and how could they evaluate progress. 2, they helped mandate that coordination that we know is needed between public sector partners at times. And then 3, it really did map out how states would implement what are enormous sums of money. So you want that documentation, you want that thought process, you want that strategy. So from the analysis, we surfaced a few things. The first is that states unilaterally, states and territories, all 52 plans, the primary barrier to digital equity and states actually achieving digital equity, which we can say that for another time on whether or not one can actually achieve digital equity. But the all plans said that the primary barrier to digital equity was the availability and the affordability of broadband. Let me just tell you, as somebody who specializes in state policy, you never get that much agreement across states. Red states, blue states, very rare. So the fact that all of these states said, like, yeah, there are other challenges, but the biggest challenge is that we got to make sure that these connections are available and that folks can afford them when they are available. We'll talk about this a little bit later, but one of the other things that came through in the digital equity analysis was how states were planning on improving and increasing access, not just in residential spaces, like in affordable housing communities or in senior centers, but also in third spaces, so community centers, community healthcare facilities. So the digital equity funds are not just on skilling and access to devices, which we'll get to. It also really is about increasing connectivity. So the second trend that we found is that there is second trend with high alignment between states is that digital skills and access to devices, significant barrier. And not just that folks don't know how to use technology when they have access to it, but how are they really applying those skills to use applications that are becoming pretty, status quo for folks, either when they're looking for jobs, when you're trying to talk to your doctor, trying to log into your kids' education management system, and also too upskilling and reskilling into different roles. So what states found fairly consistently was that access to appropriate devices was a challenge, but then also folks really being able to apply the digital skills that they had either in new ways or to kind of take that next level up in their skilling. Additionally, there were noticeable and fairly acute rates of these challenges within certain populations called covered populations, but also within certain sectors. So there were significant trends where this was impacting agriculture and healthcare. Similarly, when we're talking about population-based challenges, you see higher rates of these challenges and barriers among veterans populations. English as a second language. So what this did was allow states to really start prioritizing where they were going to target their funds. So instead of it being like, we're going to use all money to solve all things, they really were able to isolate what the most significant and acute needs were within certain populations or within certain sectors. Finally, the The third, sorry, I just skipped really far ahead in my notes. I apologize, folks. It was a long travel day yesterday, so I'm still kicking into West Coast time. The most important thing, particularly for this group and building on the research that y'all discussed last week, states really are viewing digital equity as the keystone, the cornerstone, whichever analogy you want to use, for unlocking economic opportunity. And that is because of what we call the downstream benefits. So it is the application of technology, it is the application and usage and the skills as applied to job skills, as applied to healthcare education. Just to be clear, broadband alone, digital skills, those are not going to solve the economic challenges that are facing this country. They can't, those are not in themselves a silver bullet. However, what we do know now is that you cannot solve those things. You can't solve those access gaps. You can't solve those opportunity gaps without broadband and without digital skills. So with that, let's move to the next slide. This is testing my own digital literacy skills, maybe. Okay. So when we are thinking about how states really view the economic benefits of broadband expansion, and how do they plan to focus on digitally enabled economic development? The first is through boosting workforce digital skills. So approximately 92% of jobs today require some form of digital skills. What's also interesting, though, is that there's a lack of standardization in how we measure and evaluate digital skills across the country and by sector. That makes sense to a certain degree, but you do want to have some type of skilling framework and measurement that you can measure progress against. And so as a result, both Pennsylvania and Arizona are two states that plan on developing certifications to help measure those digital skilling accomplishments and needs. The second is around solving the workforce shortage, particularly in the broadband industry. So, helping ensure that there are enough folks on the ground who can build and maintain the networks and have careers in telecommunications in the long term. Third is remote work. So how are we keeping folks in place? How are we combating the population and brain drain, particularly in rural communities, by investing in opportunities, one, to upskill populations, two, to make sure that they have the connections that they need in order to work remotely, and three, keep them, and then also the tax revenue in those communities. The fourth is where we actually saw a lot of prevalence and focus and emphasis on digital skills for agriculture. This was in helping smaller, particularly family-owned farms, go through that digital transition in order to capitalize on all the efficiencies that you can access through smart ag adaptation today. That is one of the highest areas of overlap between covered populations and specific sectors is rural communities and agriculture. Sorry, again. Okay, I just have to be patient. Who knew? So economic development isn't the only focus. We also see that states are tying their digital equity plans to other priorities and other policy priorities. The right after economic development is education and healthcare. This isn't surprising for any of you who have worked in this industry for a long time. And there are a couple of interesting examples coming through in that and how states want to really build up that access outside of the home. One of them is in increasing connectivity in schools, so hours of operations, making sure that kids can and their families can access internet outside of school hours. Interesting, Ohio, I think, will be a state to watch as they implement and build out an expanded telehealth program. They launched a pilot during COVID for behavioral health, addressing behavioral health shortages, particularly in elementary schools and rural communities, and they plan to roll that out statewide. So that will be a really interesting thing to watch, not only how they plan to address a critical shortage in mental or in behavioral health workers in schools, but then how they how they develop that systems-wide approach across the state and outside of just that small geography where they did the pilot. There are two other areas where we saw states tying their digital equity plans to other policy priorities. Civic and social engagement is one. So how are we helping folks just stay connected with one another in a digital world? And then one interesting thing coming out of Georgia also kind of ties into the certification piece that I discussed earlier, but it's helping folks build more fluency and online safety skills. And so particularly with aging Americans who can fall prey to predatory scams and just, I mean, I don't know if you guys know this, but like cybersecurity is very important. And a lot of Americans don't have that digital fluency in order to protect themselves and their information online. So Georgia is moving forward with developing a certification to ensure that folks are not only accessing it, but they're staying safe while they are online. Finally, we flagged Idaho as one of the states that is focusing on really that access to essential services. So how are we thinking about covered populations or specific target populations who may have a harder time either applying and adapting existing skills, such as folks who are leaving the military. They may have certain digital training that they left the military with, but what does that really look like in the civilian space? Or folks who are leaving those previously incarcerated populations. How do you make sure they've got the digital skills that they need to secure employment moving forward? So there's a lot of thought, not only in, a lot of helping these sort of public sector groups work together, but then also ensuring that websites and platforms are accessible for those audiences. All right. So it's not just the Battle Group that's recently come out with research on the economic impact of broadband. It's also a group called the Center on Rural Innovation, which Fiber Broadband Association was also involved with that research. And I think that there is a well-established relationship between broadband availability, broadband adoption, and economic advancement. What is important about the research that's coming out now is that it was completed during and after COVID. So when we saw a lot of those advancements in fiber, in particular, in upgraded wired-based solutions, once we saw the public sector and the private sector both increasing their investments, it's making it harder for folks to say, well, you don't need like faster speeds in order to do these things. What we are actually seeing now is there's correlation, if not direct causation, that we can attribute fiber-based, high-speed wire-based connections to economic advancement. It's a really important thing for us as we think about BEAD, as we think about DEA investment, and ensuring that we are thinking about investing publicly funded, or taxpayer dollars, in networks that are able to sustain these important connections moving forward. The final thing that's not on this slide, but I think is important to note, is that we've got all the positives associated with, fiber and economic impact, business growth, self-employment, love it. What is also in that research is about business loss in communities that don't have high-speed connections, that don't have high rates of adoption, that the researchers observed businesses leaving. So that's an important thing to keep in mind as well. Sorry, I'm trying to leave time for discussion. So just zipping through these slides. We can, okay. So we're almost done. I talked at the outset about how Congress designed BEAD and DEA to work together. And that's true. That's why these plans are important. That's why it's understand how states are thinking about really that step-by-step process of we're designing the net, or we're understanding where the gaps are. We're designing the funding proposals. We're thinking about the partners who need to come to the table, et cetera, et cetera. But what's interesting, and what I think often doesn't really get discussed, is how both BEAD and DEA are thinking about increasing connections just in different places. So as we know, BEAD is really focusing on residential connectivity. Yes, there may be funds for small businesses and anchor institutions, but it really is about residential connectivity. DEA is kind of building on top of that. So thinking about those third spaces, and again, community centers, public Wi-Fi, because we need these connections wherever we go. And so what DEA is doing, what some states are doing, is thinking about where are folks going to need access outside of the home, and building those into public and community spaces. So I think that we can talk about the complementarity of, BEAD's focusing on infrastructure and then DEA is focusing on skills and devices, but it is a little bit more nuanced than that. And as we think about like wholly connected communities and spaces, what we are seeing through the DEA plans is that they are really thinking about the fully connected community, not just the residential connectivity. Just thinking about it. Okay. We are almost done. Before we move, though, I know that there are going to be questions around, what is going to happen given the outcomes of the election. And the short answer is we don't know. But what we do know is that Congress was already thinking ahead and thinking about how not just broadband as a tool for universal service, but really as a tool for economic empowerment, for access to those essential services. And what we learned was that actually what a lot of states, governors had already been preaching for many years, which was if you don't have this access, if you don't have these skills, you cannot compete in today's economy. So as we think about sort of the what if of moving forward, we do want to think about a couple of things. The first of which being that we need to maintain momentum. We are 3 years into this work, and some days it feels like it's gone by like that. Other days it feels much slower. But I think that we've had phenomenal partnership from industry, phenomenal partnership and enthusiasm from state government, from other partners on the ground and in the private sector. And so we want to maintain that momentum in order to achieve the economic advancement that could come with this. And we're at a critical moment in funding where if we lose that momentum, I think we're going to lose a window really to make the type of impact that we know that these funds can have. The final thing is that, we want to make sure that lawmakers know how money is being spent and the impact that those funds are having. Because these aren't going to be these are one-time investments in the sense that BEAD and DEA are appropriated dollars. But that doesn't mean that the need for funding will stop. We'll need to maintain networks. We'll need to eventually upgrade. More importantly, we know that the funds that have been allocated for the Digital Equity Act, particularly when it comes to thinking about skilling, it's not enough. We have a lot of digital transformation ahead of us. And so it's just going to be even more important for us to understand the effects of these funds. So before I wrap, let's talk about kind of where we are just briefly. And BEAD, now that all of the Digital Equity Act plans have been approved, and so too have now the initial proposals for BEAD. Texas received their approval last week. It's very exciting. That's $3 billion. And last week also, Louisiana announced that they had submitted their final proposal. And I think, yes, we can talk about the commitment to fiber, which is exciting for the state and for folks in Louisiana. But I want to wrap by focusing on that $500 million in non-deployment funds, where the state is committing funding to a series of other agencies, education, healthcare, small businesses, in order to, again, ensure that these funds are used for their purpose, which is improving economic advancement and access to essential services across the state. So with that, thank you very much for the opportunity to walk through our research. Happy to take any questions y'all have.
Well, Kathryn, as always, really appreciate all the hard work you and your team have been doing. So some of the audience questions, a lot of them are around, the new administration and what's going to happen, as you mentioned. But what is your feeling working with all the states? I mean, what we're hearing is no matter what happens, the states feel that fiber is critical for economic development, just as every study has shown. But what about digital equity? Is that is where the state's feeling no matter what happens in DC.
Yeah, I think right now states are assuming, what we are hearing is that states are assuming the status quo with respect to funding, and also because they don't really have time to waste. I mean, I know I just said 3 years feels like forever, but Congress was pretty clear in their statutory requirements on timing, so they have to keep charging ahead as though things are going to stay the same. I think, as with any administration turnover, the states are assuming that there will be changes to the funding requirements themselves. DEA is, I don't want to say it's tricky. It is, what's interesting is the politicization of something that folks know could have a significant economic benefit on Americans. Like that, the economy was the thing in the 2024 election. And working with governors, including Republican governors, they may not like that word equity, so they call it digital opportunity, but they understand why those funds are needed. They understand the populations that are being impacted by the lack of digital skills, the lack of competition, that folks aren't employable in some ways. So I think that for now, like I said, folks are just assuming the status quo on funding. We'll see what ultimately happens, but I think that the more that we can say, like, yes, and on the word equity, let's talk about what this really means, and how states plan to use these funds. Maybe we can bring some of the temperature down.
Well, I mean, certainly, as I mentioned, every governor is in the economic development business. Every governor is in getting jobs to their states. And so getting fiber and get digital skills to every citizen is critical. Now, this was designed to have three components, right? It was to have the access, the digital opportunity, I'll call it, and then affordability. ACP kind of dried up before first line got deployed.
Yeah.
So does that undermine? I mean, how do we get to affordability then?
Yeah, there's no easy answer there. But we do know that, I mean, states can't use these funds for subsidies. So that's one option off the table. I think that this is where, states have traditionally done a good job working on P3s. I think it depends on the state, to be clear, and it depends on the historic program, but this is why we need providers to come to the table, as y'all have, and say, this is what we can afford. This is what we can afford to meet our bottom line in this service area. And I think one of the missed opportunities around the discussion on the low cost service option was elevating the diversity in projections that were coming back from states and elevating the range, because that gives us such a better understanding of the economic pressures that are facing internet service providers to connect these communities. And there's no judgment on either side. It just, that's the business. So I think we are working now, particularly with state lawmakers, to talk about the economics of deployment in the long term. We know that we're going to need universal service fund reform. We need to address this subsidy question. And there are no easy answers on either. But I think in the short term, what we hope is that providers will continue coming to the table and being good partners, as they have, in working with the states and others to say, this is what we can realistically afford. Can we talk about how we make the match better? Can we talk about, how we think about the structure of the funding itself? So,
well, and the good news is
policy work to do. Yeah.
There's no service that continuously gets cheaper than fiber on a cost per megabit basis. So fiber provides the lowest cost service and the highest bandwidth. But Kathryn, thanks again. Really appreciate everything that you and your team do to help advance, our nation. And I hope that everybody can join us next week. It's going to be an amazing session next Wednesday. We're going to get together with a Corning Opticals Communications top guy, Mike Bell, the Senior Vice President and General Manager, to discuss his reflections from 33 years in the industry and what's next. So a conversation with Corning's Mike Bell. He's an amazing guy if you don't know him, and he'll have some great insights. So you're not going to want to miss that. So we'll see you guys next Wednesday. Hope everybody has a wonderful Thanksgiving. And Kathryn, thanks for joining us from California.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Happy Thanksgiving, y'all.